The rain was coming down like it had always been, a steady patter against the metal roof that once sheltered lives from a world that never forgave mistakes. Thunder rolled in the distance, but it was the kind that vibrated in the bones, low and threatening, the kind that made you question whether the earth was really alive. Every inch of this place had a story to tell, one most people would never want to hear. The animals didn't mind, though they had been waiting. There was no beginning to Earth's history, not one that mattered. It wasn't the type of place you could explain with years or centuries, or even with the great civilizations that had risen and fallen. Their legacies crumbled into dust. Time here wasn't measured in human achievements. It was measured in survival, the kind of survival that transcended species and echoed in the DNA of every living thing. Each corner of the world, every inch of soil, carried the unspoken truth. The world doesn't care if you understand it. Somewhere in the outback, miles from the nearest sign of human life, a lone figure crouched in the red dirt. The man's breathing was controlled, too even for the tension that surrounded him. He had become a part of this place long ago, his instincts blending with the unforgiving landscape. Dark clouds churned overhead, a storm about to break, but the man's eyes weren't on the sky. They were on the horizon, on the edges where the light began to bend. The heat made the land shimmer, but the shapes that moved within it were all too real. This wasn't just any invasion. He had seen those before, fought them, bled because of them, and buried too many of his own. No, this was something older, deeper. He couldn't explain how he knew, but he felt it in his bones. It was an instinct, a gnawing recognition, something that gnawed at the back of his mind with the weight of inevitability. They had come. The aliens were moving in, even if their sleek ships weren't visible in the sky just yet. Their kind never showed their hand too early. They would take their time, feel out the terrain, mock the environment as they always did. Aliens like these had seen 1,000 worlds crumble under their technology, had laid waste to entire systems with their machines. Their armor gleamed, their weapons hummed, their soldiers moved in perfect unison. And yet, they had no idea what waited for them here. Australia didn't need an army to protect itself. The land had its own arsenal, a set of rules only it understood. The man, Jackson, had seen it too many times. The soldiers, the colonizers, the explorers who had thought themselves capable of taming Earth's most dangerous corners, their bones left to bleach under the relentless sun. He had been one of them, once. But that had been a lifetime ago, and the landscape had taught him in the way only it could. By taking everything. He squinted against the distance, watching the slow crawl of the alien scout party. A dozen figures moved in a tight formation, helmets and armor gleaming under the overcast sky. They were cautious, but not enough. They would never be enough here. It wasn't the snakes that would get them. Not the spiders, either. The locals always fixated on those, but the truth was the outback itself was the deadliest thing here. The heat, the water, or lack thereof, the sheer scale of nothingness that stretched out forever. And within that nothing, there was something. Always something. He wasn't alone in his watch. A low growl rippled through the silence beside him. Jackson turned, his eyes resting on the hulking figure crouched beside him, the alien defect. Terranoc's species was built for war, massive, with muscles that rippled beneath thick, scaled skin. His eyes gleamed with intelligence, something most of the aliens' kind lacked when they entered Earth's atmosphere. Terranoc had been different from the beginning. He had learned respect the hard way. Unlike the soldiers marching on their feudal conquest, Terranoc understood. "You think they'll survive?" Terranoc's voice was gravel, grinding through the translator fixed to his neck. Jackson said nothing at first. He didn't need to. Both of them knew the answer. "They'll die like the rest," Jackson finally said, his voice low. It wasn't speculation. It was a fact, carved out of experience and knowledge passed down through generations. But not quickly. The land will take its time with them. Terranoc's eyes narrowed, watching the distant movement of his former comrades, their sharp formations blurring as they ventured deeper into the outback. The heat was already playing tricks on them, distorting their vision. They would be on edge, expecting Earth's military, the human resistance, to meet them head-on. They would never see the real threat coming. The scouts stopped near a rocky outcrop, pausing to scan the area with their advanced tech. Jackson almost felt a pang of pity for them. Their tech would fail them soon enough, just like it had for every other invader that had ever landed here. The first strike wouldn't come from the animals. It never did. No, it was the silence that would get them. The profound, empty quiet that would settle into their bones. They would begin to realize how small they were, how insignificant their armor and weapons were in the face of this land's indifference. They would start to sweat, their water rations draining faster than they'd anticipated. The heat would tighten around them, squeezing out their confidence drop by drop. And then, when they were finally on edge, when they were looking in all the wrong places, that's when the land would move. Jackson felt the shift in the air before he saw it. The wind picked up, carrying a smell that was distinctly metallic. He stiffened. "They've drawn blood," Taranok muttered, his gaze sharp on the horizon. Jackson didn't have to ask how he knew. Taranok's people were sensitive to the unseen forces, the things that lingered on the edges of perception. He trusted the aliens' instincts more than his own at this point. It wouldn't be much longer. The alien soldiers had no way of knowing what awaited them just beyond the rocky outcrop. It wasn't human resistance, not the ambush they'd been trained to expect. It wasn't even the usual predators of the outback, the deadly creatures every guidebook warned tourists about. No, this was older, deeper, something that had been waiting far longer than any of them could comprehend, and they had woken it up. Jackson's eyes narrowed as the first soldier fell, his scream lost in the sudden rush of wind. The others barely had time to react before the ground beneath them shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to throw them off balance. It wasn't an earthquake, not in the traditional sense, but this land had a way of moving that defied explanation, defied logic. The creatures that emerged from the shadows were not the kind that belonged in any textbook, not even the kind Jackson had encountered in his military days. These were the result of something far older, something alien. Their forms were twisted, unnatural, as if the land itself had shaped them to be the ultimate predators. Taranok tensed beside him, his massive frame shifting slightly as he prepared for the inevitable fight. "They'll be torn apart," the alien said, his voice grim. Jackson's jaw tightened, his eyes still locked on the distant figures as they scrambled to defend themselves. They wouldn't stand a chance. But this was only the beginning. He could feel it in the air, the growing tension, the sense that something far worse was waiting just beyond the horizon. Australia was just the start, and whatever had been unleashed here, it wasn't going to stop. "They don't know what they've awakened," Jackson said, his voice low. Taranok glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "But we do." Jackson watched as the chaos unfolded, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. Not that it would do much good out here. Against these kinds of threats, human weapons had their limits. This wasn't just about brute force or firepower. It was about knowing the land, and Australia knew how to fight back. The alien soldiers had no idea what they were facing. They were skilled, no doubt, trained for combat in hostile environments, equipped with the best technology their civilization could provide. But this wasn't the battlefield they'd been prepared for. They hadn't anticipated a world where the terrain itself would fight them, where the rules of engagement weren't governed by any strategy or intelligence they could comprehend. Jackson saw the moment it clicked for them. The moment their training failed them. One of the soldiers, the one closest to the fallen scout, hesitated for just a fraction of a second. His weapon, a sleek, almost organic-looking rifle, trembled in his hands as he stared at the thing that had taken down his comrade. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood in the way they understood. It was something else, something woven into the very fabric of the land. The soil moved under their feet, shifting in subtle waves like a snake coiling beneath the surface. And then the ground erupted. The soldiers reacted instinctively, raising their weapons and opening fire. Bright, searing bolts of energy cut through the air, burning the landscape. The noise was deafening, but it did nothing. The earth absorbed the energy as if it were feeding on it. The creatures, if you could even call them that, moved with a speed and fluidity that defied their grotesque forms. They were all wrong. Legs where arms should be, eyes where there shouldn't be any. They seemed to blur in and out of existence, their very forms unstable, shifting like smoke. Jackson didn't flinch as the first alien was dragged into the ground. The soldier barely had time to scream before his legs disappeared into the soil, followed by the rest of him, swallowed whole. The others backed away, their composure unraveling with every second. Taranok watched in silence beside him, his sharp eyes narrowing, reading the situation with the same grim understanding Jackson had. "It's older than I thought," Taranok muttered, more to himself than to Jackson. Jackson nodded, his eyes never leaving the scene below. "They don't have a chance," he said. It wasn't pity in his voice. It was certainty. The landscape shifted again, this time more violently. The ground cracked open, revealing jagged stone formations that hadn't been there moments ago. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed to bleed out of the rock itself, as if the earth was birthing them to repel the intruders. One soldier stumbled backward, his helmet knocked off in the chaos, revealing a face twisted in terror. His mouth moved, shouting orders in his native tongue, but his voice was lost in the wind. Jackson took a step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. "They don't even know what hit them," he said quietly. There was no joy in it, no satisfaction, just a cold, brutal understanding of how this was going to end. Taranok's jaw clenched. "They'll send more. They always send more." Jackson didn't respond. He knew Taranok was right. The alien general wasn't the type to back down after a single failed operation. He would regroup, reassess, and come back stronger. But that wouldn't change the outcome. Earth wasn't a world that could be conquered with numbers or firepower. It had its own defenses, ancient and merciless. The remaining soldiers fell back, retreating towards the dropship that had brought them here. But Jackson knew it wouldn't help them. Not anymore. The land had woken up, and once it had you in its grip, it didn't let go. A sharp crack echoed through the air, followed by the sound of stone grinding against stone. The ground under the dropship heaved, and the metal beast lurched to one side, its landing gear sinking into the earth, as if it were quicksand. The pilot, realizing the danger too late, attempted to lift off, but the engines whined, struggling against the impossible weight dragging the ship down. The last of the soldiers scrambled towards it, desperation clear in their every movement. They were out of their element, caught between two forces they couldn't fight, the land beneath them, and the creatures born from it. One by one, they were picked off, some swallowed by the shifting ground, others torn apart by the strange, twisting shapes that stalked them from the shadows. Jackson didn't move. He'd seen enough to know how this would play out. The ship groaned under the pressure, its sleek metal frame buckling as the ground pulled it under. Within moments, it was gone, buried beneath the red soil, as if it had never been there at all. For a long moment, there was only silence. The creatures, their job done, seemed to dissolve back into the earth. The ground settled, returning to its natural state. It was as if nothing had happened. Taranok exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air. "They were scouts," he said. "Just a first wave. The real force will come next." "I know," Jackson replied, his voice hard. He turned to look at Taranok, his eyes sharp. "We need to move." Taranok didn't argue. He had learned long ago that Jackson's instincts were as sharp as any weapon. Together, they began their descent from the rocky outcrop, their movements swift and purposeful. Jackson's eyes scanned the horizon, watching for any sign of movement. But for now, the land was still. They walked in silence for a time, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. Jackson's mind worked in overdrive, assessing their options. They couldn't stay here, not with the rest of the invasion force undoubtedly on its way. The general wouldn't take this loss lightly. He would return with more soldiers, more firepower. But it wouldn't matter. The land would still win. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the oppressive heat began to fade, replaced by the chill of the approaching night. Jackson's pace quickened. They needed to reach the bunker before dark. The creatures that came out at night were worse. Much worse. Taranok, despite his size, moved silently beside him. Jackson had always been impressed by the alien's ability to blend into the environment, despite his bulky frame. But Taranok wasn't like the others. He had learned respect, earned it the hard way. The bunker was nestled deep within the rock, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Jackson had built it himself years ago, back when he still believed in preparing for the worst. Now it was just routine. The entrance was hidden behind a thick layer of brush and rock, designed to keep out prying eyes. Jackson pushed through the foliage, revealing a small keypad embedded in the stone. He punched in the code, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. They stepped inside, the cool air hitting them immediately. Jackson closed the door behind them, sealing it tight. The walls were thick, reinforced with steel and concrete. It wouldn't stop the land, but it would give them time. Taranok dropped his gear on the floor and sat heavily in one of the chairs that lined the small space. Jackson moved to the control panel, his fingers dancing over the keys as he brought up the satellite feed. The screen flickered to life, showing a live view of the surrounding area. For now, it was quiet. "They won't stop," Taranok said, his voice low. "You know that." Jackson leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. "They can try," he replied, "but this isn't their fight anymore." Taranok looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screen, watching the endless expanse of red desert. It stretched out before them, vast and unyielding, a landscape that had existed long before humans had set foot on it, and it would exist long after. "This place," Jackson began slowly, his voice rough. "It's not just Earth. It's something older. Something that was here long before us. Maybe even before the land itself." Taranok frowned, confusion creasing his brow. "You're saying Earth isn't what we think it is?" Jackson shook his head. "Not exactly. Earth is what it is. But there's more to it than that. Something deeper. Something that's been waiting." "For what?" Taranok asked, his voice quiet now, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Jackson's eyes darkened. "For someone to wake it up." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Taranok sat back in his chair, his eyes distant as he considered Jackson's words. "And the aliens?" he asked finally. "What do they have to do with it?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "They've started something they can't control, something that's going to consume them. This place, it's alive, Taranok, and it's hungry." Taranok's gaze flickered to the screen, where the desert stretched on, endless and silent. "They'll be back," Taranok said after a moment. "And when they come, they'll come with everything they've got." Jackson nodded. "Let them. It won't matter. Not anymore." Taranok looked at him, his expression unreadable. "What are you planning?" Jackson didn't smile, but there was something hard and dangerous in his eyes. "We're not waiting for them to come to us," he said quietly. "We're going to bring the fight to them." Jackson and Taranok moved with purpose through the dimly lit corridor of the bunker. The thick, reinforced walls offered temporary security, but Jackson's mind was already far from the cold comfort of concrete and steel. His thoughts raced, considering what they were about to do, the scale of it. Taranok's large frame loomed beside him, a silent shadow, but Jackson could sense the unease rolling off him. Even for a creature as hardened as Taranok, the idea of what lay ahead was enough to unsettle. Alien or not, there were some lines that, once crossed, changed the nature of the fight. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were something else. Jackson reached a table at the far end of the room, its surface scattered with old maps, blueprints, and pieces of scavenged alien tech. His hand hovered over a small device, a curved metallic object that seemed almost organic. It pulsed faintly, a soft, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. "That's the key, isn't it?" Taranok's voice broke the silence. There was a rough edge to it now, a tension that hadn't been there before. Jackson nodded, picking up the device. It was the only thing they had managed to salvage from the wreckage of the alien ship before it was swallowed by the Earth. Something far more valuable than the dead soldiers it left behind. "It's their control mechanism," Jackson said, turning the device over in his hand. Whatever they use to command their tech, ships, weapons, maybe even themselves, it runs through this. But it's more than that. It's connected to something much deeper. Not just their machines, but to the network that binds everything together. They've tapped into something older than any of us realized. Taranok took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You're saying they're not the ones in control? Jackson shook his head slowly. Not exactly. The tech they use, it's built on principles that go beyond anything we've ever seen. They think they control it, but they've only unlocked the surface. There's something deeper, something ancient buried within it, like an intelligence, a consciousness waiting to be fully awakened. That's what's driving this, Taranok murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The land, the creatures we've seen, it's all part of the same thing. Jackson placed the device back on the table, his mind still grappling with the magnitude of what he was saying. They didn't come here to invade Earth. They came to control it, to take the power that's been sleeping beneath the surface for eons. And now we have the key, Taranok said, his voice grim. Jackson looked at him, his expression hard. Now we wake it up. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. Taranok's eyes flicked to the maps, the blueprints, and the glowing device, as if seeing them in a new light. Once we do this, there's no going back, he said slowly. I know, Jackson replied. But there's no other choice. If we don't take control of this thing, they will. And when that happens, Earth will be nothing more than a resource for them. A power source. Taranok's eyes darkened. You really believe it's that simple, that we can just take control of something this big, this ancient? Jackson's jaw tightened. It's not about belief. It's about survival. Taranok exhaled, his breath heavy in the enclosed space. Then we need to act fast. The main invasion force won't be far behind. Jackson moved to the control panel, tapping a few keys to bring up the live satellite feed. The desert stretched out before them, still and silent. But the silence was deceptive. Somewhere out there, the real threat was gathering. We're not going to survive this if we wait for them to come to us, Jackson said, his voice flat. We take the fight to them now. Hit them before they have a chance to regroup. Taranok raised an eyebrow. You have a plan? Jackson's lips curled into a hard smile. We use their own technology against them. The alien ship they lost, its signal is still active. If we can hijack it, we can lead their forces into a trap. Taranok grunted. And what about the land? The creatures? Jackson glanced at the device on the table. We wake them up too. We give the invaders a war they've never seen before. The air in the bunker seemed to hum with an electric tension. Taranok stood silent for a moment, considering the gravity of what Jackson was proposing. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of something far bigger than either of them had ever imagined. Something that could reshape the very nature of their fight. Finally, Taranok nodded. Let's do it. Jackson wasted no time. He grabbed the device and pocketed it, moving quickly toward the exit. Taranok followed close behind, his heavy footfalls echoing in the tight space. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit them like a wave. The landscape was quiet, the horizon bathed in the pale glow of the stars. But Jackson's instincts told him it was only the calm before the storm. The real fight was coming. They moved swiftly through the wilderness, the vast expanse of desert stretching out before them like an endless, barren sea. Jackson's thoughts were sharp, calculating their next move. It wasn't just about outmaneuvering the enemy. It was about controlling the battlefield in a way they hadn't yet understood. The alien device pulsed faintly in his pocket, as if it were alive, sensing what was coming. Jackson knew that once they activated it, everything would change. The land itself would wake, the creatures would stir, and the invaders would find themselves caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. By the time they reached the edge of the desert, the sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jackson stopped, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The alien ship's signal was weak, but still traceable, a faint beacon calling out to the invaders' fleet. "This is where it starts," Jackson muttered, pulling the device from his pocket. He glanced at Taranok. "Once we do this, there's no turning back." Taranok's eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. "Then let's make it count." Jackson pressed his thumb against the surface of the device, and it pulsed in response. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder, a low, deep rumble that echoed through the land. And then, with a sudden burst of light, the device activated. The effect was immediate. The landscape around them began to shift, the ground rippling like water. Jackson could feel the power surging beneath the surface, ancient and primal. The creatures were waking up, stirred by the call of the device, and they weren't the only ones. In the distance, a dark shape appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. The invaders' fleet was coming. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment everything changed. The invaders thought they had come to conquer Earth, but they had no idea what they were really up against. As the first ships descended from the sky, Jackson and Taranok stood their ground. The war had begun, but it wasn't the war anyone expected. This was something far older, far darker. And Earth was ready to fight back. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the ancient pulse of the planet surging up through the soles of their boots. Jackson could feel it, a low, constant vibration that resonated deep in his bones. This was no ordinary rumble. It was the awakening of something long buried, something far more dangerous than anything they'd anticipated. His hand tightened around the alien device, the glow from its surface now steady and bright, casting an eerie light over the desert sands. Taranok stood silent beside him, his eyes locked on the horizon where the invaders' fleet approached. There was a weight in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Jackson could see the tension in Taranok's jaw, the unspoken dread of what they had just unleashed. "They don't know what's coming," Jackson muttered, more to himself than to his companion. Taranok's gaze shifted to him, his alien features inscrutable. "Do we?" The question hung in the air, cold and heavy. Jackson didn't answer. He wasn't sure anymore. They had set something in motion, something far bigger than either of them could control. But there was no turning back now. A deep, resonating growl echoed across the desert, the sound rolling through the dunes like thunder. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The creatures were awake. Somewhere beneath the sand, the ancient guardians of this world had stirred from their slumber, called forth by the device in Jackson's hand. He could feel their presence, vast and terrifying, pressing against the edges of his mind. "We've got to move," Jackson said, his voice tight. "They'll be on us any minute." Taranok nodded, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. The dark shapes of the alien ships were closer now, their sleek forms cutting through the sky with precision. They were coming in fast, and there was no mistaking their intent. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to finish what they'd started. Jackson turned and started moving, his legs carrying him swiftly across the shifting sands. Taranok followed close behind, his heavy footfalls sending small tremors through the ground. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but Jackson's mind was sharp, calculating. They had one chance to turn this around, and it rested on the device they had barely begun to understand. As they ran, Jackson's thoughts raced. The invaders had underestimated them, underestimated Earth. They'd come here expecting an easy victory, believing they could crush humanity and seize the power hidden beneath the planet's surface. But they didn't understand what they were dealing with. They didn't know the price of waking the ancient forces that slept within the Earth. Jackson glanced at Taranok. The alien's face was hard, his eyes distant, but there was a flicker of something there, something Jackson hadn't seen before. Fear, not for himself, but for what they had unleashed. Taranok understood, perhaps better than Jackson, the true nature of the power they now wielded. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about control, and control had its costs. They reached the edge of a jagged cliff, the ground dropping away sharply into a deep ravine. Jackson stopped, scanning the horizon. The ships were closer now, their sleek forms cutting through the sky like dark, predatory birds. He could see the faint glimmer of energy shields around them, shimmering in the early light of dawn. "Here," Jackson said, panting slightly as he pointed to a narrow outcropping of rock. "We make our stand here." Taranok nodded, but there was a look of uncertainty in his eyes. "And what of the creatures?" Jackson felt the weight of the device in his hand, its soft hum growing louder, more insistent. He met Taranok's gaze, his jaw clenched. "We let them do what they were meant to do. We give the invaders something they'll never forget." Without another word, Jackson slammed the device into the ground. The effect was immediate. The earth buckled beneath them, a shock wave rippling outward from the point of impact. The pulse of energy surged through the ground, reaching deep into the core of the planet, waking the ancient guardians fully. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, a tension that made Jackson's skin crawl, and then, with a deafening roar, the ground exploded. Massive forms erupted from the earth, towering creatures of stone and shadow, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They moved with terrifying speed, their limbs crashing against the ground with enough force to shake the very mountains. Jackson stared in awe. These were no mere animals. They were the true rulers of this world, ancient and unstoppable, bound to the earth by forces older than time itself. Taranok took a step back, his eyes wide. "What have we done?" Jackson couldn't tear his gaze away from the massive creatures as they surged forward, heading straight for the invaders. "We leveled the playing field." The first of the alien ships reached the edge of the ravine, its sleek hull gleaming in the morning light. Jackson held his breath. The invaders opened fire, their weapons lighting up the sky with streaks of energy. But the creatures didn't slow. The energy beams struck their stone bodies and dissipated harmlessly, as if the creatures were absorbing the very force of the attack. "They can't be stopped," Jackson whispered, a sense of dread creeping into his voice. "They're unstoppable." The invaders must have realized it too. The ships began to retreat, pulling back in the face of the advancing creatures. But it was too late. The guardians of the earth moved with relentless purpose, tearing through the enemy lines with brutal efficiency. Taranok watched in silence, his face pale. This isn't what I thought would happen." Jackson turned to him, his expression grim. "We didn't wake them to save Earth. We woke them to reclaim it." The sky darkened as more ships descended from the heavens, their forms blotting out the light. The full might of the invaders' fleet had arrived. But now, they weren't just fighting Jackson and Taranok. They were fighting the planet itself. And the planet was winning. As the battle raged on, Jackson felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no longer a war for survival. It was something far deeper, far more terrifying. The invaders had come to Earth to seize its power, but in doing so, they had awakened something far worse. And now, there was no stopping it. The ground beneath them shuddered again, a deep, primal force that Jackson could feel in his bones. The creatures moved with increasing speed, their massive forms cutting through the enemy like blades through water. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. They had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. And it was only just beginning. The sky above was no longer the familiar blue. It had turned a bruised shade of violet, streaked with the fiery aftermath of the alien ships that had been ripped apart by the ancient creatures. Jackson watched in silence, his mind reeling from what he'd just witnessed. The invaders had come with their advanced technology, their promises of dominance, and they had been torn down by forces that were beyond even their comprehension. But this wasn't victory. He could feel it in the air. The balance of power had shifted, yes, but not in their favor, not in humanity's favor. What they had unleashed wasn't just a weapon. It was something far older, far more ruthless, a force that didn't care who it destroyed in its path. Taranok's breathing was shallow, his alien lungs struggling to take in the thick, electric air. His gaze flickered from the battlefield to Jackson, a question lingering in his eyes. What now? Jackson had no answer. The guardians of the earth, these massive stone creatures, moved through the desert like titans, their bodies carving craters into the landscape with every step. The invaders were scattering now, retreating in disarray. But retreat wasn't survival. One of the fleeing ships veered sharply, only to be caught mid-air by a creature's colossal arm. It was torn in half like paper, its metal innards spilling across the sky in a rain of debris. The air was filled with an eerie silence in the aftermath of each kill. No one spoke. There were no war cries, no shouts of triumph, just the unsettling calm that followed complete annihilation. "We didn't just wake them up," Taranok said at last, his voice trembling. "We've unleashed the past. They don't see us as saviors. They see us as invaders too." Jackson remained silent. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the last of the invaders' ships were disappearing, fading into the violet sky. He had thought that waking the ancient guardians would give them a fighting chance. But now he realized they hadn't been given control, they had relinquished it. The creatures weren't allies. They were indifferent, primal forces, as capable of turning on them as they had been on the invaders. "How do we stop them?" Taranok asked, his voice cutting through Jackson's thoughts. Jackson clenched his fists. "We don't." The weight of the truth hit hard. There was no stopping what had begun. The creatures were bound to the planet, driven by instincts and commands that no one alive could understand. They didn't see invaders and defenders. They only saw trespassers. Jackson turned away from the destruction and began walking toward the barren expanse behind them. The desert stretched on endlessly, silent and uncaring. Taranok hesitated, but after a moment he followed, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stillness. "What's the plan?" Taranok asked, his tone more resigned than hopeful. "There is no plan," Jackson said, his voice hard. "There's only survival now. We need to get far away from here, as far as we can. The Guardians will keep hunting until they've eradicated every trace of the invasion, every trace of foreign interference." Taranok's eyes widened in realization. "That includes us." Jackson nodded grimly. The very forces they had called upon for salvation were now their greatest threat. They weren't just invaders in the eyes of the Guardians, they were outsiders, too. Everything that wasn't part of the ancient order of Earth would be purged. They continued in silence, the enormity of their situation pressing down on them like a physical weight. Jackson's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't the future he had imagined. He had thought humanity would find a way to survive, to fight back and reclaim the planet. But the planet had never belonged to them. It belonged to something far older. The sound of shifting stone made him stop in his tracks. Taranok froze beside him. They both turned slowly, dread clawing at their insides. One of the Guardians loomed in the distance, its massive body silhouetted against the darkening sky. It hadn't seen them yet, but it wouldn't be long. The creature moved with deliberate purpose, scanning the ground with its glowing eyes. It was searching for any signs of the invaders, any remnants of the battle. Jackson's heart raced. If it found them, they wouldn't stand a chance. Not against something that was essentially part of the Earth itself. "We need to move. Now," Jackson whispered urgently. Taranok nodded, his body tense. They broke into a run, their movements quick and silent, hoping to put as much distance between themselves and the Guardian as possible. The landscape shifted around them, the once familiar terrain now feeling alien and hostile. As they ran, Jackson couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The invaders had been the immediate threat, but the true danger lay in the forces they had awakened. The Guardians weren't bound by politics or motives. They were bound by something deeper, something elemental. "They'll never stop," Taranok said breathlessly as they weaved between the jagged rocks. Jackson didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The Guardians wouldn't stop until every trace of the invaders, and anyone else who didn't belong, was wiped from the surface of the planet. Ahead of them, the terrain began to change. The desert gave way to a stretch of ancient, cracked stone, littered with the remnants of structures that had long since crumbled to dust. Jackson paused, his eyes scanning the area. It was a graveyard, an ancient civilization, buried beneath the sand, long forgotten. "They were here before," Taranok said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The Guardians, they've done this before." Jackson swallowed hard, the weight of history pressing down on him. This wasn't the first time the Earth had defended itself against invaders, and it wouldn't be the last. As they stood in the ruins of a long-dead world, Jackson realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't just stumbled into a war. They had become part of a cycle, one that had been repeating for millennia, and they were just the latest casualties. Jackson's grip tightened on the alien device in his hand. It pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power they had thought they could control. But now it was clear they were nothing more than pawns in a game far older than they could ever comprehend. As the ground trembled once more and the distant roar of the Guardians echoed through the air, Jackson knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time. And there was no escape from the reckoning that was coming. The violet sky above darkened further as the Guardians closed in, their stone bodies blending into the landscape, unstoppable, inevitable. Jackson's last thought as they moved deeper into the ruins was that perhaps humanity had never stood a chance. Not against the invaders, not against the Earth itself. And as the horizon quaked with the weight of the approaching Titans, he wondered if this had been the plan all along. A planet's final defense. A reckoning that had been centuries in the making. The end wasn't coming. It had already begun. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the whispers of a forgotten age. Jackson and Taranok moved quickly, weaving through the crumbling remnants of a civilization lost to time. Every step felt heavier than the last, each breath a struggle as the oppressive energy of the awakened Guardians surged through the ground beneath their feet. The violet sky had deepened to an unnatural, bruise-colored twilight, casting long, eerie shadows across the ancient stone. There was no mistaking the power in the air now. It was raw, unyielding, and all-encompassing, a force far beyond the technology of either humans or the invaders. It had shaped this world for millennia, long before any sentient species had dared to claim it as their own. "We can't keep running forever," Taranok said, his voice strained but steady as he kept pace beside Jackson. Jackson didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of their options, or the lack thereof. He glanced down at the alien device still clutched tightly in his hand. It pulsed with a soft, almost hypnotic rhythm, as if it were alive, connected to something far greater than either of them could fathom. "You're right," Jackson finally said, his voice low. "Running won't save us, but fighting might." Taranok looked at him, a flicker of confusion crossing his alien features. "Fight? Fight what? The Guardians? We're insects to them, Jackson. We can't fight something we don't understand." Jackson's grip tightened around the device. "Maybe we don't need to understand them. Maybe we just need to find a way to disrupt them, to sever their connection to the Earth." Taranok's brow furrowed. "You're talking about cutting off the very thing that gives them life. Do you even know where to start?" "I don't," Jackson admitted. "But this," he held up the device, "this thing woke them. It must be connected to whatever controls them. If we can reverse it, maybe we can shut them down." Taranok's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're gambling with forces we barely comprehend." Jackson met his gaze. "What other choice do we have?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with the weight of the decision they were about to make. In the distance, the Guardians moved like living mountains, their enormous forms barely visible, but ever present. Each tremor in the ground was a reminder that time was slipping away, and soon there would be nothing left to fight for. Taranok let out a slow breath, his resolve hardening. "Then we need to find the source, the heart of whatever is controlling them. We need to go deeper." Jackson nodded, knowing that what lay ahead could be far worse than anything they'd faced before. The Guardians weren't the only danger. The planet itself was waking up, and with it, the remnants of its ancient past. They pressed on, moving through the labyrinth of ruins, the alien structures towering around them like the skeletal remains of giants. There was an eerie beauty to it all, as though the very architecture held the memory of the world's former glory. Yet beneath that beauty lurked something darker, something that whispered of an inevitable end. As they ventured further, the air grew colder, the oppressive energy of the Guardians giving way to something else, something older, more insidious. Jackson's skin prickled, and he could feel a shift, as though the ground itself was watching them. "There," Taranok said, pointing toward a jagged opening in the ground ahead, a massive chasm that seemed to pulse with a faint light. Jackson squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The light wasn't natural. It shimmered like a living entity, twisting and writhing just beneath the surface. It was as if the Earth's core itself had been exposed, raw and vulnerable. "That's it," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's where it's coming from." They approached cautiously, the weight of what they were about to do hanging heavily in the air. The closer they got, the more Jackson could feel the pull of the energy, drawing him in like a predator luring its prey. "This is madness," Taranok muttered under his breath. "Even if we reach the source, there's no guarantee we can stop it." Jackson shot him a grim look. "Madness or not, it's the only chance we've got." The chasm loomed before them now, the pulsing light casting ghostly shadows across their faces. Jackson could feel the device in his hand vibrating, reacting to the energy with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. He knelt at the edge, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared into the abyss. "It's alive," he said, his voice filled with awe and dread. "Whatever this is, it's alive." Taranok's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and understanding. "It's not just the Guardians. The Earth itself, it's conscious." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting the Guardians, they were fighting the planet itself, a living entity that had been lying dormant for eons, waiting for the moment to awaken. "This changes everything," Taranok said, his voice barely a whisper. Jackson's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of it all. The Guardians weren't protectors. They were the Earth's immune system, designed to purge any threat to its existence. And now, humanity was the infection. He looked down at the device, its glow almost blinding now. "We need to act fast," he said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "If we don't shut this down, there won't be anything left to save." Taranok nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. "And if we fail?" Jackson didn't hesitate. "Then we die knowing we tried." With that, he slammed the device into the ground at the edge of the chasm. The effect was instantaneous. A shock wave of energy exploded outward, the ground beneath them trembling violently. The light from the chasm surged, flickering wildly as if it were being torn apart. For a brief moment, Jackson felt hope, felt like they might actually have a chance. But then, the ground split open, and something began to rise. It wasn't a guardian. It wasn't a creature. It was the Earth itself. A massive, towering form, made of stone, roots, and molten core, emerged from the depths of the chasm, its eyes burning with the fire of the planet's core. It was ancient, more ancient than anything Jackson had ever imagined. It wasn't just alive, it was the embodiment of the Earth's will, a force beyond comprehension. Jackson's heart froze in his chest as the creature turned its gaze toward him. This was it. The true force behind the Guardians, behind the planet's defense. This was the end. And as the Earth's avatar raised its massive hand, Jackson knew one thing with terrifying certainty. There was no stopping this. The reckoning had come. And they were too late. The Earth itself moved, unrelenting, inevitable. Jackson's last thought as the molten hand descended was that maybe this had always been the plan. The final defense of a planet that needed no saving, only purging. And in that moment, the line between the invaders and humanity blurred. They were all trespassers. The Earth would reclaim its own. The molten hand of the Earth's avatar loomed overhead, its immense heat radiating down on Jackson and Taranok like a death sentence. Jackson's body tensed, every instinct screaming for him to move, but there was nowhere to run. This wasn't just a fight against overwhelming odds, it was the end of any rational understanding. The Earth had become something more than a planet. It had become an active participant in its own defense, a conscious, ancient force that had waited millennia to reclaim what was always its own. But then, something strange happened. The air around Jackson seemed to still, and the oppressive heat from the molten hand paused mid-motion, It was as if the Earth's consciousness was reconsidering its next move, observing them. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, sweat streaming down his face as he realized there was a faint glimmer of hope. Something had shifted. He could feel it, a presence, an intelligence behind the Earth's avatar that hadn't been there moments before. "It's watching us," Taranok whispered, his voice barely audible, but thick with realization. "It's waiting." Jackson's eyes flickered to the alien device still pulsing at his feet. The shockwave he'd unleashed hadn't just triggered the Earth's retaliation, it had connected them to it. For the first time, the planet's will was not just acting blindly. It was thinking, perceiving. "The device," Jackson said, his voice low but urgent. "It's not just a weapon. It's a communication tool. We've been using it wrong. We need to talk to it." Taranok looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Talk to a planet? Are you hearing yourself?" But Jackson wasn't listening. He bent down, hands trembling, and pressed his palm against the device. The energy surged up through his arm, searing hot and ice-cold at the same time, as if it were trying to fuse with him. Images flashed behind his eyes, alien landscapes, star systems, memories not his own. The Earth's consciousness flowed through him, too vast, too old for his mind to fully grasp. Yet in that storm of thoughts, he found something, a connection. It wasn't words, not in the traditional sense. It was deeper than language. A raw, primal understanding of the Earth's purpose. Its will was undeniable. It would purge anything that threatened its existence. The invaders, the technology, the humans, they were all intrusions on a natural order that had existed long before life had even begun to crawl across the surface. But there was more. Buried deep in that consciousness was something else, something darker, a conflict, a hesitation. The Earth's will wasn't as unified as Jackson had thought. It was fragmented, pieces of it pulling in different directions, ancient instincts clashing with something newer, something foreign. "The invaders," Jackson gasped, pulling his hand back from the device, his skin burning. "They didn't just come to conquer. They infected the Earth. They left something behind." Taranok stared at him in disbelief. "You're saying this planet is corrupted?" "Not corrupted," Jackson said, his mind racing to piece it together. "Manipulated. The Guardians, the Avatar, they're not acting out of their own accord. They've been repurposed. We've been fighting a planet that's under control, just like us." The truth was devastating. The invaders had done more than just attack humanity. They had altered the very fabric of the planet's consciousness. They had left behind a seed, a parasitic influence buried deep in the Earth's core, twisting its natural defenses into something more violent, more destructive. The Earth's will was no longer its own. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. This changed everything. If they could find the source of that corruption, they might stand a chance, not just at surviving, but at freeing the planet itself. "We need to destroy whatever they planted here," Jackson said, his voice growing more certain by the second. "If we can remove the invaders' influence, the planet will stop seeing us as the enemy." Taranok didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue either. He knew as well as Jackson that there was no turning back now. The Guardians were closing in, and the Earth's avatar loomed above, waiting for its command to strike. "How do we find it?" Taranok asked, eyes scanning the desolate horizon. "This corruption, where would they have hidden it?" Jackson glanced at the chasm, the light within pulsing like a heartbeat. "The core," he said. "It's buried deep, somewhere in the planet's heart. That's where the invaders left their mark. If we can reach it, destroy it, we might be able to sever their control." Taranok shook his head slowly. "And how exactly do we get to the core of a living planet, Jackson? We barely survived getting this far." Jackson didn't have an answer, but as he looked into the swirling energy below, he felt the Earth's will pressing against his mind once more, guiding him. "We don't," Jackson said, his voice steady. "We let it take us." Taranok's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're suggesting we let the planet consume us?" Jackson nodded. "It's the only way. The device, it's linked us to the Earth's consciousness. If we surrender to it, if we allow ourselves to become part of it, we might be able to reach the core from within. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. There was a long, tense silence as Taranok considered the plan. He glanced at the towering avatar, its molten eyes burning with ancient fury, then back at Jackson. Finally, he nodded. If this is how it ends, then let's end it on our terms. Without another word, they approached the chasm. The pulsing light grew brighter, more intense, as they neared the edge. The energy crackled in the air, and Jackson felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. There was no turning back now. Together, they jumped. For a moment, there was nothing but free fall, an endless descent into the unknown. The light enveloped them, searing hot and blinding. Jackson felt his consciousness stretch, pulled in every direction at once, as if he were being torn apart and reassembled all at once. And then, everything went still. Jackson opened his eyes and found himself standing in a vast, endless void. There was no up or down, no sky or ground, just an infinite expanse of shifting light and shadow. He could feel the Earth's consciousness all around him, vast and incomprehensible, like the beating heart of a god. Taranok stood beside him, his alien features unreadable in the strange light. "Where are we?" Jackson didn't answer. He didn't know, but he could feel it, the core. It was close, buried deep within the swirling chaos, a dark, pulsating mass of corruption, coiled like a serpent around the Earth's heart. "There," Jackson said, pointing toward the darkness. "That's what we need to destroy." As they approached, the darkness writhed, shifting and twisting like a living thing. It wasn't going to let them through easily. The invaders' influence was strong, deeply rooted in the planet's core, and it would fight to maintain control. But Jackson didn't hesitate. He reached out, the device in his hand glowing with renewed power, and plunged it into the heart of the darkness. The void exploded with light and sound, a violent eruption that shook the very fabric of reality. The Earth's consciousness screamed, a deafening roar that reverberated through every fiber of Jackson's being. But he didn't stop. He pressed forward, pushing the device deeper, forcing the corruption to unravel. And then, with one final, blinding flash, it was over. The darkness was gone. The Earth's consciousness fell silent. Jackson collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. He could feel the planet beneath him, no longer hostile, no longer under control. It was free. But as he looked up, he realized something terrible. The Guardians hadn't stopped. The Earth was free, but the cycle of destruction had already begun, and there was no stopping it. Jackson's last thought as the void collapsed around them was that they had freed the planet, but doomed themselves in the process. And the reckoning would continue, with or without them. The ruins above trembled as the Earth shifted beneath them. The Guardians moved forward, unstoppable, their purpose unyielding. The corruption was gone, but the purge had already been set in motion. The cycle had begun, and there was no escape. The weightlessness returned, gripping Jackson and Taranok as they drifted in the aftermath of the Earth's inner battle. The void, once full of chaos and corrupted consciousness, had fallen into a profound silence, like the calm before an even greater storm. Jackson's mind ached, still feeling the aftershock of what they'd done, freeing the Earth's will from its manipulative chains. But the victory felt hollow. Taranok floated beside him, his alien features hardened, eyes narrowing as if he were trying to make sense of the space they now occupied. They were no longer in the core, not exactly. They were somewhere between the planet's mind and reality, an in-between state that felt more like a thought than a place. "What now?" Taranok asked, his voice low, almost wary. He was no longer the cold, calculating soldier. Something had shifted within him too, though Jackson couldn't say what. It wasn't fear, it was something closer to dread. Jackson didn't answer. His eyes scanned the expanse, the formlessness of it. The Guardians were still out there. The destruction hadn't stopped, and yet they were disconnected from it, trapped in this metaphysical limbo. His mind worked, searching for answers in a place where logic no longer applied. But then something spoke. It wasn't a voice. It was the Earth itself, a pulse of thought that rippled through the space around them. Not hostile, not friendly, just there, waiting. Why? The question wasn't aimed at them directly, but Jackson felt it pass through him like a riddle he wasn't prepared to answer. The Earth wasn't sentient in the way he had assumed. It was old, primal, bound to cycles that transcended human understanding. But now, for the first time, it seemed curious. It wanted to know why they had freed it. Jackson inhaled sharply. "We didn't come here to save you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the planet could even hear him. "We came to survive." Survival is irrelevant. The thought hit him hard, colder than anything he'd felt in that void. The Earth didn't care about survival in the same way they did. It existed in cycles, in death and rebirth. There was no emotion tied to its will, just the inevitability of its process. Taranok, sensing the shift in Jackson's expression, tilted his head. "What are you hearing?" Jackson's mouth was dry. "It's not over." "What do you mean?" "We stopped the corruption, but the purge, its purpose, it's still in motion. The Earth doesn't care about us. It doesn't even care about the invaders. It's going to reset itself. Everything." Taranok's eyes widened, the gravity of their situation dawning on him. "Then why are we still here? Why hasn't it ended us?" Jackson shook his head. He didn't know. But there was something else lurking beneath the Earth's consciousness, something that hadn't revealed itself yet. "You are a threat." The thought rippled through the void, colder now, more defined. The Earth had made up its mind. Jackson could feel it, the heavy weight of judgment pressing in on them. It didn't understand them, not fully, but it recognized them as an anomaly, an error in the grand cycle. They were part of the disease that needed to be purged. "We need to get out of here," Jackson said, urgency rising in his chest. "It's going to turn on us. We're not supposed to exist in its equation." "How?" Taranok's voice was strained. "We're trapped inside its consciousness. There's no exit." Jackson's eyes darted, mind racing. There had to be something they could do. They were connected to the Earth, tethered to its very mind by the device they had used. Maybe, just maybe, they could hijack that connection. Bend it. He glanced at the device in his hand. It still hummed with energy, the same energy that had allowed them to interact with a planet on this level. Maybe they could use it to escape, to pull themselves back to reality. Or maybe they could do something far more dangerous. "What if we force it to stop?" Jackson said, his voice quiet but deliberate. Taranok blinked. "What?" "The Earth's purging everything because that's what it's programmed to do. But what if we change that? What if we use this connection to rewire it? Make it see us as part of the cycle, not an enemy?" Taranok stared at him, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "You're talking about reprogramming a planet." "I'm talking about surviving. If we don't do this, it'll wipe out everything, including us." Taranok hesitated, but he knew Jackson was right. The planet's judgment was final, and there was no time to argue. He nodded, a grim determination settling over his features. Jackson closed his eyes, focusing all his will on the device, pushing his thoughts outward, deeper into the Earth's consciousness. He could feel its vastness, stretching beyond anything his mind could truly comprehend. But in that vastness, there was a thread, a singular point of control where the planets will converge. He latched onto it, forcing his own thoughts through the connection, bending the Earth's perception. It resisted, hard and cold, like trying to bend iron with his bare hands. But Jackson didn't let go. He pushed harder, forcing his will into the planet's mind, altering the very fabric of its reality. For a moment, the void trembled, and Jackson felt a crack in the Earth's consciousness. The cycle paused, just for a heartbeat, long enough for the planet to consider something new, an alternative path. But then, the void shattered. The world around them collapsed, pulling them back into the physical realm with a violent surge. Jackson gasped, the weight of gravity hitting him like a sledgehammer as he and Taranok fell to the ground. The chasm still pulsed with energy, but the Guardians had stopped moving, frozen in place. They had done it. The cycle had been interrupted. But something was wrong. Jackson could feel it. The Earth was still watching them. It hadn't accepted the new reality. It was waiting, biding its time. The purge had been delayed, but not cancelled. They had bought themselves a moment of reprieve, but that was all. Taranock struggled to his feet, eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to move. Now." Jackson nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The planet hadn't given up. It was evolving, adapting to their interference. Whatever they had done, it had only made the Earth more aware of them. The next time it came for them, it wouldn't be as passive. They were running out of time. As they stumbled away from the chasm, Jackson glanced back one last time. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The Earth wasn't finished with them. The next reckoning would be far worse. And this time, there would be no escape. The landscape stretched out like a desolate expanse of broken, smoldering ruins, crackling with the energy of a world caught between annihilation and renewal. Jackson's body ached from the weight of what they had done, his every step feeling like an echo of the violent clash they had just survived. His mind, still tethered to the Earth's consciousness in ways he didn't fully understand, pulsed with warnings. The planet wasn't finished with them. They had forced it to pause, but that pause wouldn't last. Taranock walked beside him, his gait stiff, eyes scanning the horizon for threats that neither of them could fully predict. He was more silent than usual, which unnerved Jackson. He had come to rely on the aliens' cutting observations, his sharp instincts. Now, there was only that haunted look in Taranock's eyes, as if the weight of their actions had finally caught up with him. "We bought ourselves time," Jackson muttered, more to himself than to his companion. "That's all we did. The purge. It's still coming." Taranock grunted, barely acknowledging him. He had been distant ever since their return to the physical realm, his thoughts clouded by the revelation that they were fighting not just for survival, but against the very essence of the Earth itself. The realization was paralyzing, like a cold, sinking weight. How could you reason with something so vast, so indifferent to life? Jackson's hand still clutched the device, its pulse now softer, less urgent, but still alive with energy. This was their only hope, their link to whatever sliver of control they could still exert over the planet's will. And yet, even as Jackson held on to it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the device was more dangerous than it seemed. It had connected them to the Earth's consciousness, but that connection was a two-way street. "Do you feel that?" Taranock finally spoke, his voice low and grave. He didn't need to clarify, Jackson felt it too. A tremor, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The Earth was moving, but not in the way they had experienced before. It wasn't the Guardians or the shifting landscape. It was something deeper, something crawling beneath the surface, waking up. "They're coming," Taranock added, a sharpness in his voice now. "We didn't stop the purge. We just disrupted it. Whatever is left, it's still moving forward." Jackson's grip tightened on the device. "We need to find out what else is down there. Whatever we did, it wasn't enough." They moved quickly, the ground beneath them rumbling, as though the Earth itself was shifting its bones. The path ahead was littered with debris, remnants of long-forgotten structures, civilizations that had once thrived before being swallowed by the planet's unrelenting cycles. This place had been purged before. There was a certain poetry to that, Jackson thought bitterly, though it did nothing to calm the gnawing sense of dread that clawed at his gut. Ahead, the sky darkened unnaturally, a bruised purple-black, swirling with violent, unfamiliar storms. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged patterns, light the far-off horizon where something massive loomed. It wasn't a mountain, though it towered as high as one. It was organic, shifting, alive. It pulsated with the same energy as the chasm they had just escaped, but this was no simple scar in the earth. This was something else entirely, something vast and ancient. "We need to go there," Jackson said, pointing toward the looming mass. Taranock's expression darkened. "We've barely survived everything so far. Now you want to head straight into that?" Jackson didn't look back. He couldn't. "There's no other option. Whatever's causing this, it's there. I can feel it. That's where the Earth's mind is truly focused. That's the source." For the first time, Taranok didn't argue. He seemed to understand that whatever resistance he offered would be meaningless. This was their fate now, spiraling further into the unknown, chasing answers that might never fully reveal themselves. But there was something in Jackson's tone, a certainty that made him follow. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was hope. Either way, they were in too deep to turn back. As they trudged closer, the air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive humidity that stung their lungs. The ground beneath their feet became soft, spongy, almost like flesh, pulsating in time with the distant mass ahead. It was as though the Earth was no longer just a planet. It was becoming something else, an organism, alive in ways they hadn't expected. Suddenly, a sharp tremor ran through the ground, nearly knocking them off balance. Jackson's hand instinctively reached out to steady himself, only to recoil in horror as the ground writhed beneath his fingers, shifting like muscle and sinew. He glanced at Taranok, who was already on edge, his hand gripping the weapon slung across his back. The air vibrated with an unsettling hum, not sound, but a feeling, like pressure building up inside their heads. Jackson knew what it was. The Earth was reaching out again, trying to communicate, trying to impose its will on them. But this time, it wasn't curious. It wasn't asking questions. It was angry. A guttural sound erupted from the horizon, a deep, primal roar that echoed across the landscape. Jackson and Taranok froze as the ground split open ahead of them, revealing a monstrous shape clawing its way out of the earth itself. It was one of the Guardians, but this one was different. Larger, more twisted. Its form was grotesque, like it had been born of the Earth's corrupted will, shaped by both natural and unnatural forces. Its molten eyes locked onto them, glowing with a violent intensity. "Run," Jackson shouted, though the command seemed futile. There was nowhere to run. The Guardian lunged forward, its immense body surging toward them with terrifying speed. Jackson and Taranok barely managed to dive out of the way as the creature's colossal limbs crashed into the ground, sending shockwaves through the air. The sheer force of the impact threw them off their feet, tumbling across the soft, pulsating terrain. Jackson's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. They couldn't fight this thing, not head-on. It was too big, too powerful. But they had the device. Maybe, just maybe, they could use it. "Taranok," Jackson shouted, scrambling to his feet. "The device. We have to use it." Taranok glanced at the device in Jackson's hand, his eyes narrowing. "It barely worked last time. What makes you think it'll work now?" "We don't have a choice," Jackson yelled, dodging another swipe from the Guardian's massive clawed hand. Without waiting for a response, Jackson thrust the device toward the Guardian, pouring all his focus into the connection. The device pulsed violently, its energy surging outward, latching onto the Guardian's form. Jackson could feel the Earth's consciousness again, but this time it wasn't fragmented. It was singular, focused, a raw, elemental force of destruction. He pushed harder, trying to bend the Guardian's will to his own. The device trembled in his hands, its energy flickering dangerously as it strained against the weight of the Earth's power. The Guardian froze, its molten eyes flickering for just a moment, as if it were caught between two commands. But then, with a violent shudder, it broke free of the device's influence, its roar reverberating through the air with deafening force. Jackson stumbled back, his heart sinking. It hadn't worked. The Guardian lunged again, and this time there was no dodging it. But just as the creature's massive form closed in on them, the ground beneath them buckled and split open once more. This time, it wasn't a Guardian emerging from the Earth. It was the Earth itself. The ground writhed and twisted, swallowing the Guardian whole in a violent eruption of rock and molten energy. Jackson and Taranok stared in stunned silence as the Guardian disappeared, consumed by the very planet it had been created to protect. "What just happened?" Taranok asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jackson didn't have an answer. The Earth was changing, evolving. It had turned on its own creation, but for what purpose? Had they somehow influenced it, or was this part of its inevitable cycle of destruction and rebirth? As they stood there, the ground beneath them continued to shift, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Jackson could feel the Earth's consciousness pressing in on him once more, but this time it wasn't angry. It was curious again, watching, waiting. "Something's coming," Jackson whispered, more to himself than to Taranok. Taranok glanced at him, his expression grim. What now? Jackson didn't know. But as he looked toward the horizon, where the massive organic mass still loomed, he felt a deep, unsettling certainty. This wasn't over. They had stopped the purge, disrupted the cycle, but the Earth hadn't given up. It was still evolving, still adapting, and whatever it was becoming, whatever new force it was preparing to unleash, it was far beyond their understanding. The next reckoning was coming. And this time, there would be no delay. Jackson's knees buckled as the ground beneath them continued to pulse, its rhythm unnatural and disorienting. It wasn't like anything he'd felt before. This time, it was deeper. It wasn't just the Earth vibrating. It felt like it was alive in a new way, breathing under their feet, responding to forces Jackson couldn't begin to understand. He and Taranok stood in the dim light of an unnatural sky, the dark purple clouds swirling above them like a bruise on the planet's surface. Whatever was happening beneath the ground was now mirrored in the heavens above. The looming mass on the horizon hadn't moved, but its presence pressed on them with suffocating weight. Jackson felt it in his chest, each breath harder to pull in than the last. Whatever had just swallowed the Guardian, it was connected to that thing. The Earth's mind, or whatever was left of it, had a new purpose. Taranok shifted uneasily beside him, scanning the darkening horizon. He had lost the stoic calm Jackson was used to. Now, his face was tight with tension, his eyes constantly flicking toward the growing storm. "We've got to move," Taranok said, his voice rough, like he was swallowing glass. "We can't just stand here and wait for whatever's coming." Jackson nodded, though the weight of their situation pressed down on him. His body ached, not just from exhaustion, but from the residual connection to the Earth. It was still there, that faint pulse in the back of his mind, like a low hum he couldn't shake. The device in his hand had grown dimmer, its energy drained from the failed attempt to control the Guardian. But it still thrummed with potential, waiting for the next command. Jackson's mind raced. They had disrupted the purge, but the Earth wasn't done with them. They needed more than brute force to survive what was coming. They needed understanding, a way to decipher the cryptic signals the planet was sending. "There's something else out here," Jackson muttered, almost to himself. "We haven't seen it all, not yet." Taranok shot him a sidelong glance. "What do you mean?" Jackson swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "The Earth, it's not just angry, it's adapting, it's thinking. I can feel it. It's—" Before Jackson could finish, the ground beneath them convulsed again, more violently this time. A deep, guttural sound, like the planet itself was groaning in pain, filled the air. Jackson stumbled forward, barely catching himself on the spongy ground. It wasn't just the Earth that was shifting now. The very atmosphere seemed to throb with malevolent energy. Taranok reacted faster, steadying himself and grabbing Jackson's arm. "We have to move, now." Without another word, they began to run, their feet sinking into the increasingly soft ground as they pushed toward the distant mass on the horizon. Each step felt heavier than the last, the landscape warping around them like a nightmare. The sky crackled with jagged bolts of lightning, the air thick with the scent of ozone, and something else, something rancid, like decay. Jackson's lungs burned as they sprinted, his mind flashing with images he didn't understand. Fractured visions of ancient cities, towering structures lost to time, and something dark, something coiled and watching from deep beneath the Earth. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow, a presence far older than he could comprehend. Taranok skidded to a stop, holding up a hand. "Wait." Jackson halted beside him, panting. "What? Why are we?" "Listen." For a moment, there was nothing but the distant rumble of the Earth and the crack of lightning. But then Jackson heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, massive ones, the kind that came from something much larger than the Guardian they had just escaped. Jackson's heart hammered in his chest. What the hell is that? Taranok's face was pale, his eyes wide. It's not a guardian. It's something else. Something bigger. The sound grew louder, closer. The ground shook with each thunderous step, and the distant horizon began to shift. The looming mass was moving now, slowly, deliberately, like a sleeping giant stirring from a long slumber. Jackson's mind reeled. What kind of nightmare had they awoken? "There's no way we can outrun that," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. Taranok clenched his jaw. "Then we don't run. We need to figure out what it is, and if we can stop it." Jackson shook his head, his hand tightening around the device. "It's not just the purge anymore. This is bigger than that. The Earth, it's becoming something else. Something worse." Taranok's eyes narrowed. "We stop it, or we die. There's no other choice." Jackson stared at the approaching mass, his thoughts racing. The device in his hand flickered weakly, its power nearly depleted. They couldn't rely on it alone. They needed a new plan, something that could stop whatever force was driving the Earth's transformation. As they stood there, Jackson's mind flashed again with images, fragments of knowledge he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Ancient symbols, energy fields, pathways buried deep beneath the planet's surface. The Earth's consciousness was still reaching out to him, feeding him pieces of a puzzle he hadn't asked for. "The device isn't enough," Jackson said, his voice shaky but firm. "There's something deeper, a core or a source of power. I can feel it. We need to find it." Taranok's expression hardened. "And how do we do that? Just dig?" "No," Jackson said, shaking his head. "We need to go down." Taranok blinked. "Down?" Jackson nodded, swallowing hard. "Beneath the surface. There's something down there, something controlling all of this. The Guardians, the Purge, everything. It's all coming from below." Taranok stared at him for a long moment, then nodded grimly. "If you're wrong, we die." "If we don't try, we die anyway," Jackson said. Without another word, they turned and began to run again, this time toward the nearest chasm in the Earth. The sky roared above them, the storm intensifying as they neared the gaping fissure. The air was thick with tension, like the planet itself was watching their every move, waiting to see what they would do next. As they reached the edge of the chasm, Jackson peered down into the depths. It was dark, impossibly deep, and filled with an eerie glow that pulsed in time with the planet's rhythm. He could feel it pulling at him, like gravity, like destiny. Taranok glanced at him, his eyes hard. "You sure about this?" Jackson took a deep breath, his mind still buzzing with fragments of the Earth's consciousness. "No, but we don't have a choice." With that, they leaped into the abyss. The fall was longer than Jackson had anticipated, the air rushing past them in a deafening roar. The glow from the depths grew brighter as they descended, the rhythmic pulse growing stronger, more insistent. Jackson's mind spun with 1,000 thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. He had no idea what awaited them at the bottom, only that it was their only chance. They hit the ground hard, rolling as they landed on a strange, spongy surface. Jackson groaned, pulling himself to his feet. The air down here was thick, humid, and stifling, like they had landed inside a living thing. The walls of the chasm pulsed with a sickly green glow, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to breathe. Taranok stood beside him, weapon drawn, his eyes scanning the dark, pulsating landscape. "Where now?" Jackson didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, focusing on the pulse in his mind, the connection to the Earth. He could feel it down here, stronger than ever, like a heartbeat, guiding him toward something deeper, darker. "There," he said finally, pointing toward a narrow passage leading further into the depths. They moved cautiously, the oppressive air pressing in on them from all sides. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in, pulsating with the same eerie glow. Jackson's skin crawled as they walked, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with every step. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, the air grew colder, the glow dimmer. The pulse in Jackson's mind quickened, a frantic rhythm that mirrored his racing heart. They were close now. He could feel it. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a vast chamber, and Jackson froze. At the center of the chamber was a massive, pulsating mass of energy, its surface shifting and writhing like a living thing. It was unlike anything Jackson had ever seen, dark, organic, and alive with power. This was the source, the heart of the Earth's consciousness. Taranok stared in awe. "What the hell is that?" Jackson swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he raised the device. "It's the Earth's mind, or what's left of it." Before Taranok could respond, the mass began to shift, its surface rippling as though it was aware of their presence. Jackson felt a sudden surge of energy in his mind, the connection to the Earth growing stronger, more intense. It wasn't just watching them now, it was reaching out. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the mass began to pulse faster, its energy filling the chamber with an overwhelming pressure. Jackson staggered back, his mind reeling from the force of it. He could feel it inside him, probing his thoughts, his memories, searching for something. "We have to destroy it," Taranok shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing roar of energy. Jackson shook his head, his mind racing. "No, we need to control it." Taranok stared at him in disbelief. "Control it? You're insane." Jackson didn't respond. His focus was on the device in his hand, its dim glow flickering as it reacted to the energy in the chamber. This was their only chance. If they could tap into the Earth's mind, they could stop the purge, stop whatever transformation was happening. But if they failed, Jackson gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around the device. Jackson's grip on the device tightened as the swirling energy in the chamber intensified. The Earth's mind, if that's what it truly was, seemed to awaken fully in their presence. It was no longer a passive force. The pulsating mass of energy before them began to throb with an almost predatory rhythm, like a heart beating too fast, its intentions no longer concealed. Jackson could feel it probing deeper into his thoughts, seeking something he couldn't yet comprehend. The connection was overwhelming, and it took all of Jackson's mental strength to hold onto his identity, to prevent his mind from being swallowed whole by the sheer immensity of what lay before him. Taranok was shouting something, his voice drowned out by the deep, resonant hum that filled the cavern. But Jackson was only half listening. He felt something beneath the surface of his consciousness, a knowledge hidden in the corners of his mind, buried deep within his memories. The device in his hand flickered, reacting to the Earth's pulse, and he suddenly understood. This was never just about control. It was about communion. "Jackson," Taranok's voice finally broke through the chaos. He grabbed Jackson's arm, pulling him back, eyes wide with fear. "It's going to kill us. We need to get out of here now." Jackson blinked, the haze lifting momentarily as he registered Taranok's panic. The chamber was vibrating violently now, the very walls pulsing in time with a living energy at the center. The light in the room shifted, casting deep, unnatural shadows, and the air grew so thick it was like trying to breathe through wet cement. Yet, Jackson stood his ground, a sense of clarity beginning to creep into his thoughts. "No," Jackson muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Taranok or the thing before them. "We can't leave. Not yet." Taranok stared at him, eyes wild. "Are you hearing yourself? This thing is going to tear us apart. We don't have time for this." Jackson ignored him. The truth was, he didn't have time to explain, not in a way that Taranok would understand. Whatever was in this chamber, whatever this force was, it was no longer simply a threat. It was offering something, a way forward, or a way out. It wasn't clear. But Jackson knew, deep in his bones, that this was the moment. The Earth wasn't just a mindless entity fighting for survival. It was intelligent, aware, and, perhaps most terrifyingly, it was evolving. The Purge, the Guardians, the mutations they had seen above. All of it was part of a much larger plan. A plan that Jackson was beginning to suspect he was somehow a part of. His mind flashed with images, ancient cities, sprawling civilizations that had long since vanished. He saw visions of towering spires, shimmering landscapes that were both beautiful and terrible in their alien complexity. These weren't human. This was something else, something far older, something buried deep in the Earth's past, long before humans had walked its surface. A civilization, or perhaps many, that had left their mark on the very fabric of the planet. But they were gone now, all of them, swallowed by time or some cosmic force beyond comprehension. And now the Earth was waking up again. Jackson's eyes widened as a single, terrifying thought crystallized in his mind: we're the intruders. The Earth had been home to something before humanity, a force or a people that had been long forgotten, buried under the weight of millennia. And now that force was rising, pushing back against the infestation that humanity had become. It wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a reckoning. "Taranok," Jackson said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we're not meant to stop this? What if we're not supposed to survive?" Taranok stared at him in horror. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jackson shook his head, the images in his mind coming faster now, more urgent. All of this, it's been happening for longer than we can imagine. We're just a part of it. A small part. The Earth, whatever this is, it's not just a planet. It's a living, evolving entity. It's always been alive. We just didn't see it." Taranok looked like he was about to argue, but then the ground beneath their feet lurched violently, throwing them both off balance. Jackson landed hard on his side, the wind knocked out of him. The pulse of the Earth's mind grew stronger, more insistent, and Jackson felt it crawling through him, threading through his thoughts, his memories. It was searching for something, some answer or some key. He didn't know how long he had before it consumed him entirely. He struggled to his feet, his body shaking with the effort. The device in his hand was growing hotter now, its energy spiking in response to the rising power in the chamber. Jackson realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was the key. Somehow, the Earth had chosen him, marked him. He had been connected to it ever since they had first set foot on this cursed planet. And now it was demanding something from him. "Taranok," Jackson gasped, his voice hoarse. "We have to make a choice." Taranok was still watching him, his expression torn between anger and fear. "What choice? What the hell are you talking about?" Jackson swallowed, forcing himself to focus. "We either destroy this thing, or we let it evolve. But if we destroy it, we take everything with it. The Earth. Us. Everything." Taranok's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." Jackson nodded grimly. "I am. This isn't just a fight for survival anymore. It's about what comes next. This thing, this mind, it's the planet's way of becoming something more. Something bigger. But if we stop it, we wipe everything out." Taranok stared at him, his face pale. "And if we don't stop it?" Jackson hesitated. "I don't know, but I don't think we'll survive it." The room shook again, more violently this time, and the pulsating energy in the center of the chamber began to grow, expanding outward in tendrils of raw power. The air crackled with electricity, and Jackson could feel the device in his hand vibrating wildly, struggling to maintain control. Taranok took a step back, his face set in grim determination. "Then we destroy it. We can't let it win." Jackson felt a surge of panic. Wait. But it was too late. Taranok was already moving, charging toward the center of the chamber with his weapon drawn. Jackson's heart raced as he watched, knowing instinctively that this was the wrong choice, that they were about to unleash something far worse than they could imagine. He tried to shout, to stop Taranok, but the words caught in his throat. Taranok raised his weapon, aiming for the heart of the pulsating mass. And then everything went black. When Jackson opened his eyes, he was no longer in the chamber. He was standing on a barren, lifeless landscape, the sky above him dark and empty. The air was cold, still. There was no sound, no movement, just endless, crushing silence. He looked around, trying to make sense of where he was. This wasn't the Earth. It wasn't anywhere he recognized. It was nothing. A void. A place without time, without life. And then he saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, shifting, as though it existed outside of reality itself. But Jackson could feel its presence, cold, ancient, and infinitely powerful. It was watching him, waiting. "Who are you?" Jackson called out, his voice echoing strangely in the emptiness. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, unmoving. Jackson took a step forward, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" Still, no response. But then, as he drew closer, the figure began to change. Its form shifted, solidified, and Jackson felt a wave of recognition wash over him. It was him. The figure was an exact reflection of Jackson, down to the smallest detail. It stared back at him with cold, empty eyes, its expression unreadable. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. "What is this? What are you?" The figure smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a surge of fear through Jackson's body. "I am the future," the figure said, its voice eerily calm. "I am what you will become." Jackson took a step back, his mind racing. "No, this isn't real. This is just a dream." The figure's smile widened. "Is it?" Jackson felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This place, this void, it wasn't a dream. It was a warning, a glimpse of what lay ahead if they failed. But what did it mean? Before he could make sense of it, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the figure's form began to dissolve into darkness. Jackson's heart raced as the void around him began to collapse, the darkness closing in from all sides. And then he was falling, plummeting through the void, his mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. Jackson gasped, his eyes snapping open. He was back in the chamber, the pulsating energy still surrounding him. But something was different. The air was heavier, more oppressive, and the energy in the room felt darker, more malevolent. Taranok lay on the ground nearby, unconscious, his body limp. Jackson's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to his side, checking for a pulse. He was alive, but just barely. Jackson looked up at the center of the chamber, where the Earth's mind still pulsed, its energy now crackling with a violent, chaotic intensity. The device in his hand was flickering, its power almost completely drained. They had failed. The Earth's mind had evolved, and now there was no stopping it. Jackson's breath came in shallow gasps as he struggled to process the gravity of their situation. The pulsating energy at the center of the chamber had transformed into a chaotic vortex, tendrils of raw power reaching out as if seeking something or someone to consume. He could feel it calling to him, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, and the knowledge of what they had awakened weighed heavily in the air. He knelt beside Taranok, feeling the slight rise and fall of his friend's chest. Taranok was still alive, but unconscious and vulnerable. Jackson had to act quickly. The vortex was growing stronger, and every second spent lingering risked drawing them both into its depths. With great effort, he managed to pull Taranok onto his shoulders. He felt a surge of adrenaline and desperation, urging him to flee. But the energy swirling in the chamber seemed to anticipate his move. As he turned to retreat, the ground shook violently again, and the vortex erupted with a blinding flash of light. Jackson squinted against the brightness, instinctively shielding Taranok's body with his own. The light engulfed everything, and Jackson felt the world around him rippling, shifting. Just as he thought he would be swallowed by it, the light receded, revealing a new scene. They stood in a different place entirely, a vast expanse of barren land marked by jagged rock formations and swirling dust. The sky overhead was a deep crimson, and the air was thick with a taste of ash. Jackson staggered, momentarily disoriented by the abrupt shift. He scanned their surroundings, searching for any signs of life. "Where are we?" he murmured, half to himself, half to the unconscious Taranok. A sound, a low, resonant hum, rose from the ground beneath them, vibrating through Jackson's bones. He felt it more than heard it, a calling that resonated with the core of his being. The humming seemed to pulsate in time with the chaotic energy they had just escaped, as if this place were an extension of the vortex they had encountered. Jackson glanced down at Taranok, still slumped against him, and he felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He needed to find shelter or help, something that could keep them both safe while he figured out what to do next. "Come on, Taranok," he whispered, shaking his friend gently. "Wake up. We need to move." With some effort, Jackson began to drag Taranok forward, struggling against the wind that whipped around them. The ground crunched under his feet, dry and unforgiving. He searched for any sign of refuge, anything that could offer shelter from the chaos he felt looming just out of sight. As he walked, he noticed strange structures in the distance, tall, monolithic formations jutting up from the ground like the remains of some ancient civilization. Each one radiated a faint glow, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The closer he got, the more he could feel the resonance from the ground increase, vibrating through his legs and settling in his chest. "We have to get to those," he muttered, urging himself forward. "Please, just a little further." Finally, he reached the base of the nearest structure, a towering column that arched toward the crimson sky. The surface was smooth and warm to the touch, and Jackson could feel the energy surging through it like a lifeblood. He set Taranok against the column and looked around, assessing the area for any signs of danger. The humming grew louder, and Jackson realized that it was not just a sound, but a language, a call for help or understanding. He pressed his palm against the surface of the column, and an unexpected warmth radiated from it, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. Suddenly, the ground shook violently once more, and Jackson stumbled back, panic rising as he felt the world shifting beneath him. The towering formations began to tremble, and he heard a low growl echoing through the air, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "What is happening?" Jackson shouted, his voice nearly lost in the chaos. He turned back to Taranok, who still lay unconscious. "Taranok, wake up!" As if in response to his desperation, Taranok's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes wide with confusion. "Jackson? Where?" "Here. We're safe, sort of. I think this place is alive," Jackson replied, pulling Taranok to his feet. "But we need to figure out what we're dealing with." The low growl intensified, and Jackson turned back to see shadows swirling around the base of the column. Figures began to emerge from the dust, their forms indistinct but shifting like smoke in the wind. They were humanoid, but their features were obscured, and their movements were fluid, almost like they were part of the environment itself. "Jackson," Taranok breathed, fear creeping into his voice. "What are those?" "I don't know," Jackson said, panic creeping back in as the figures moved closer. "But we can't stay here." Before they could react, the shadowy figures surged forward, surrounding them. Jackson braced himself for an attack, but instead, the figures halted a few feet away, their movements slowing as they drew near. The lead figure stepped forward, its form shifting into something more defined, a tall figure with an elongated face and piercing eyes that glowed like embers. "You have come," it said, its voice echoing in Jackson's mind rather than through the air. "Who are you?" Jackson asked, incredulous. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, a gesture that felt almost contemplative. "You have awakened the earth. You have chosen to enter the realm of the forgotten." Jackson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "We didn't mean to. We just—" "Intent does not matter," the figure interrupted, its voice unwavering. "The balance has been disturbed. You stand on the threshold of a new reality." "Reality?" Taranok echoed, his voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" "The Earth is changing," the figure replied. "It is not just a planet. It is a living entity, and you have become part of its evolution. You are either its salvation or its destruction." Jackson felt the weight of its words sink in. "What do you mean?" The figure gestured around them, and the ground pulsed, sending ripples of energy through the air. "The choice is yours. You can embrace the change and guide the Earth to a new future, or you can resist and face the consequences of your actions." Jackson exchanged a glance with Taranok, uncertainty flooding his thoughts. They had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding. "But how? What can we do?" "The power lies within you," the figure said, its voice imbued with a sense of ancient wisdom. "You must connect with the Earth. You must understand its pain, its desires. Only then can you lead it to what it must become. A moment of silence hung in the air as Jackson contemplated the weight of what was being asked of him. He felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly drowned out by a sense of responsibility. They had awakened this force, and now they had to confront it head-on. "What if we fail?" Taranok asked, his voice a whisper. "Then all is lost," the figure replied solemnly. "But there is always a path to follow, a choice to make." Jackson steeled himself. "Then we have to try. We owe it to the earth and to ourselves." As he spoke those words, he felt a surge of energy coursing through him, igniting a spark of determination. He turned to the towering column, the energy flowing from it resonating with his heartbeat. He could feel the earth's pain, its rage, and its yearning for rebirth. "Show us," Jackson said, his voice firm. "Show us what we need to do." The figure nodded, and in an instant, the shadows surrounding them surged forward, enveloping Jackson and Taranok in a cocoon of energy. The warmth spread through their bodies, and suddenly they were no longer standing on the barren landscape, but floating in a vast expanse of light and color, a breathtaking display of life and beauty. Jackson felt a connection igniting within him, a bond with the earth that transcended time and space. Images flashed through his mind, visions of lush forests, vibrant ecosystems, and ancient civilizations living in harmony with the land. The memories intertwined with the energy, wrapping around him like a living tapestry. Then, with a jolt, the visions changed. He saw the scars of humanity's greed, pollution, deforestation, extinction. The pain of the earth surged through him, and he gasped as he felt the weight of the damage done. But there was also hope, flickering like a distant star. The energy pulsed more intensely, and Jackson felt the earth's heart beating in time with his own. The shadows swirled around them, and he realized they were guiding him, showing him the path to healing. It was not about domination or control. It was about understanding, respect, and nurturing the life around them. As the vision deepened, Jackson felt a voice, soft yet powerful, rising within him. It was a call to action, a plea for change. "We can heal this," he whispered, conviction growing in his heart. "We can help it evolve into something better." The figures surrounded him, their eyes gleaming with approval. "You have chosen wisely," the lead figure said, its voice echoing in harmony with Jackson's thoughts. "Together, you will be the harbingers of change." With that, the energy surged once more, pulling them into a whirlwind of light and sound. The landscape around them felt charged with a newfound energy. Jackson stood resolute, the weight of their mission pressing down on him. Taranok, still dazed, blinked as if trying to shake off the remnants of their earlier experience. The barren land that had once seemed desolate now pulsed with potential, each vibration echoing the promise of rebirth. "Jackson," Taranok said, his voice steadier now, "we just experienced something beyond comprehension. What do we do next?" Jackson took a deep breath, feeling the lingering warmth of the energy enveloping him. "We need to gather as much knowledge as we can about this place." The figures mentioned healing, evolution. There has to be a way to understand what we're dealing with. "Right," Taranok replied, the fire in his eyes igniting as realization set in. "But how? We can't just wander around hoping for a sign." Jackson scanned their surroundings. The towering columns radiated a faint glow, each one unique, almost beckoning them closer. "We start with these structures. They might hold the answers we need." They approached the nearest column, which stood taller than any building Jackson had ever seen. Its smooth surface shimmered in the crimson light, drawing him in. "Do you feel that?" he asked, placing a hand on the cool stone. It thrummed with energy, responding to his touch. Taranok joined him, resting his palm against the column as well. "It's like it's alive," he murmured, a sense of wonder breaking through the tension. "Let's see if we can communicate with it," Jackson suggested. He focused on the energy flowing through his hand, willing it to connect with the structure. "If these beings were right about our connection to the earth, maybe we can tap into that through this." Closing his eyes, he concentrated, feeling the energy pulse in time with his heartbeat. He imagined sending his thoughts into the column, urging it to reveal its secrets. After a moment, he felt a shift, a response from the stone. Images flickered behind his eyelids, scenes of verdant landscapes and thriving ecosystems. He saw ancient trees stretching toward the sky, rivers flowing with clarity, and wildlife teeming with life. Each vision resonated with a sense of harmony, a balance that had long been disrupted. Suddenly, the images darkened, replaced by stark contrast of destruction. Jackson gasped as he saw machinery tearing through forests, rivers choked with waste, and barren fields where life had once flourished. A deep sadness washed over him, but it quickly transformed into resolve. "We can fix this," he whispered, the determination surging through him. "We can help restore the balance." When he opened his eyes, Taranok was watching him with an intensity that mirrored his own. "Did you see it too?" "Yeah," Jackson replied, still feeling the energy thrumming beneath his skin. "This place, it needs our help. But we can't do it alone. We need to reach out to others." "Others?" Taranok asked, brow furrowing. "You mean humans?" "Exactly. We need to gather anyone who will listen, anyone willing to join this cause. If we can harness the same energy we felt here, we might be able to create a movement. But we have to be strategic." Taranok nodded, the weight of understanding settling in. "We can't just storm in blindly. We'll need a plan." "Let's start by exploring the other columns," Jackson suggested. "Maybe they'll provide more insights or even connect us with other beings." They moved to the next structure, which stood slightly apart from the others. This column was carved with intricate symbols, each line radiating a sense of history and knowledge. Jackson traced his fingers over the engravings, feeling a surge of warmth as he did. "This one feels different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like it's speaking to me." Taranok stepped closer, his gaze locked on the symbols. "Can you understand any of it?" "Not exactly, but it's like it's urging me to remember something." Jackson pressed his hand flat against the stone, closing his eyes once more. The warmth enveloped him, pulling him deeper into the connection. Visions flooded his mind again, this time of a great council gathered around a similar column, beings of all shapes and sizes united in purpose. He felt their determination, their desire to protect the earth and its inhabitants. But just as quickly, those visions shifted to conflict, arguments, divisions, and a fracturing of that unity. Jackson felt the energy wane, replaced by despair. "No," he gasped, pulling back from the column. "It can't end like this. We have to bring everyone together again." Taranok's eyes narrowed in thought. If these beings once worked together, there must be a way to reignite that spirit. Maybe that's the key to our strategy. "Right," Jackson said, energized by the idea. "We need to seek out those who understand this balance. Find leaders, activists, anyone passionate about restoring the earth." As they continued their exploration, the column spoke to them, revealing fragments of history and knowledge. Each structure contained its own stories, lessons about the consequences of neglect and the power of unity. Jackson absorbed it all, feeling the weight of responsibility grow heavier. After hours of exploration, they returned to the first column, their minds swirling with information and ideas. "What's the next step?" Taranok asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We need to get back to civilization," Jackson replied. "We have to find a way to connect with people. Use technology to spread the message, maybe even document our findings. If we can show others the potential for healing, we can create a movement." Taranok nodded, a spark igniting in his eyes. "We need to gather supplies. If we're going to mobilize, we'll need food, water, and a way to communicate." Jackson grinned. "Let's head back to the ship. We can prepare and launch our plan from there." As they navigated their way back, the energy from the columns seemed to guide them, the landscape shifting around them, as if acknowledging their purpose. Jackson felt a sense of hope blossoming within him. Once they reached the ship, Jackson quickly powered up the systems. The familiar hum of machinery enveloped him, providing a sense of comfort. We're going to need the comms to reach out to others, he said, tapping on the control panel. If we can get a signal, we can start gathering our network. Taranok rifled through their supplies, gathering what they would need. I'll set up the food and water rations. We don't know how long this will take. Good idea, Jackson replied, his focus locked on the comms panel. He worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keys as he attempted to establish a connection. Minutes passed, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, the screen flickered to life, displaying a static-filled image of a nearby settlement. Jackson's heart raced. I think we've got something. Taranok leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the screen. Let's hope it holds. Jackson adjusted the frequency, clearing the static. This is Jackson and Taranok from the vessel Inspiration. We need to communicate with anyone who can hear us. We have important information about the Earth's current state and a path forward. A few moments of silence stretched out before a voice crackled through the static. This is Leader Creel of the Green Council. We're receiving your transmission. State your business. Jackson felt a rush of relief. We have uncovered something monumental. The Earth is alive, and it needs our help. We've seen the potential for healing and restoration, but we need your support to rally others. The voice on the other end was cautious. You understand the magnitude of what you're asking. Many will resist change, and we are already facing significant challenges. I know, Jackson replied, urgency lacing his words. But if we can unite, if we can show them the truth and the hope we've discovered, we can create a movement. We have to act now before it's too late. Taranok stepped closer, his expression determined. We're ready to take this fight to the next level. We've seen what happens when humanity ignores its connection to the Earth. This is our chance to make things right. There was a pause, the silence heavy with contemplation. Finally, Creel spoke again. I will convene a council. We can discuss this further, but be aware, many will question your intentions and the feasibility of your claims. Jackson nodded, understanding the weight of skepticism. We expect that, but we'll do whatever it takes to prove ourselves. Prepare for a meeting tomorrow, Creel instructed. We'll arrange for a transport to bring you here. In the meantime, gather your findings. Thank you, Creel, Jackson said, relief flooding his voice. We won't let you down. As the transmission ended, Taranok turned to Jackson, excitement mingling with anxiety. Tomorrow could be the turning point, but we need to be prepared. What if they don't believe us? We'll show them, Jackson replied, determination hardening in his chest. We've got the energy and the knowledge now. We need to present it clearly, make them feel the urgency of the situation. That evening, they worked tirelessly, documenting everything they had learned from the columns. Jackson compiled images, recorded his thoughts, and created a presentation that showcased the beauty and potential of the Earth. He wanted the council to feel the urgency, to grasp the magnitude of what was at stake. Hours later, they finally stepped back from their work, fatigue washing over them. I think we're ready, Jackson said, rubbing his eyes. Taranok nodded, his expression somber. Let's get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be monumental. The next morning, they awoke early, nerves coursing through Jackson's veins as he prepared for the meeting. He dressed in clean clothes, ensuring he looked presentable, even as his mind raced with possibilities. We'll be meeting leaders, he said, pacing the small confines of the ship. We have to make a good impression. Taranok straightened his attire, a glint of determination in his eyes. They'll see the fire in our hearts, Jackson. We just need to convey that effectively. The transport arrived shortly after, a sleek vehicle gliding silently to their ship. Jackson's heart raced as they climbed aboard, the weight of the moment settling in. He glanced at Taranok, who offered a reassuring nod. As the transport soared through the skies, Jackson caught glimpses of the sprawling landscapes below. Once vibrant cities now shadowed by pollution, forests diminished to mere patches. He clenched his fists, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the Green Council's headquarters. The building loomed above them, an impressive structure of glass and steel surrounded by flourishing gardens. Jackson could sense the energy in the air, hope mingling with skepticism. Once inside, they were ushered into a large chamber filled with representatives from various factions. Jackson's gaze swept over the room. Noting the diversity of species and backgrounds, he felt both excitement and trepidation. Creel stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention. "Welcome, Jackson and Taranok. You requested this meeting to present your findings. We are eager to hear what you have to share." Jackson stepped forward, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. "Thank you, Leader Creel, and thank you all for allowing us to speak today. We've uncovered significant insights about the Earth and its potential for restoration." He gestured to the screen behind him, where images flickered to life, vibrant landscapes juxtaposed against the devastation wrought by neglect. These columns, the structures we encountered, revealed a connection to the Earth that we must nurture and protect. As Jackson spoke, he felt the energy in the room shift. The leaders listened, some with interest, others with skepticism. He pushed through, urging them to consider the urgency of their message. Taranok stepped in, adding his perspective. "We've seen firsthand the consequences of exploitation, but we've also witnessed the power of unity. If we come together, we can mobilize a movement to heal the planet." Creel's expression remained unreadable, but Jackson could see the wheels turning in his mind. "And what do you propose as a course of action?" Jackson was ready for this question. "We need to create awareness, mobilize communities, engage leaders, and use technology to reach as many people as possible. We can host events, workshops, and demonstrations to show the potential for healing." A voice from the back spoke up, cutting through the tension. "And what makes you think people will listen? Change is difficult, and many have grown complacent." Jackson met the speaker's gaze, unwavering. "I understand the challenges, but this is not just about us. It's about the future of our planet. The longer we wait, the more we lose. We can show people the beauty of restoration, the rewards of working together." Another leader chimed in, skepticism lacing her tone. "You speak of hope, but what if your efforts are in vain? What if people refuse to change?" Jackson held her gaze, grounding himself in the energy that had flowed through the columns. "Then we'll keep fighting, but we have to start somewhere, and I believe that if we reach out to the right people, we can create a ripple effect." Creel nodded, considering their words. "You speak with conviction. I admire your passion, but passion alone may not be enough. We will need evidence, a clear plan of action to present to our communities." Jackson felt a rush of hope. "We can gather the data, organize events, and create a detailed proposal. If we're going to rally support, we need to show the potential for change." After a lengthy discussion filled with questions and concerns, the council finally reached a consensus. They would give Jackson and Taranok the resources and support to begin their movement. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the meeting adjourned, Creel approached Jackson. "Your passion is evident. I hope you can inspire others to take action. But be prepared, change is not always welcomed." "I understand," Jackson replied, determination firm in his voice. "But we'll keep pushing forward. We won't give up." In the weeks that followed, Jackson and Taranok worked tirelessly, fueled by the momentum of their success. With the support of the Green Council, they began organizing events, utilizing every resource at their disposal. Their first event was a gathering in the heart of the council's capital. They invited leaders from different sectors, hoping to ignite a spark of inspiration. Jackson prepared meticulously, ensuring every detail was perfect. As the day approached, the air buzzed with anticipation. People from all walks of life gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Jackson stood at the forefront, ready to share their message. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice steady and clear. "Today, we are here to discuss the future of our planet. We stand at a crossroads, and the choices we make will determine the legacy we leave behind." He unveiled the images they had compiled, showcasing the beauty of the earth alongside the stark reality of its degradation. As he spoke, he felt the energy in the crowd shift. Eyes widened, expressions softened. People were beginning to connect with the message. Taranok stepped forward, sharing stories from their experiences with the columns, the energy that flowed through them, and the profound connection they felt to the earth. We are not just fighting for ourselves, we are fighting for every living being that depends on this planet. Together, we can create a movement that resonates far beyond these walls. As the event progressed, Jackson could see a shift in the audience. Conversations sparked among attendees, questions emerged, and ideas flowed. Hope filled the air as people began to envision a different future. After the event, Jackson and Taranok held smaller discussions, engaging with individuals passionate about making a difference. They gathered contact information, establishing a network of supporters eager to join the cause. Weeks turned into months, and the movement gained traction. They organized community cleanup initiatives, workshops on sustainable practices, and educational sessions about the importance of ecological balance. The message spread like wildfire, igniting a passion for restoration. But challenges emerged. Resistance came from various factions, individuals set in their ways, unwilling to embrace change. Jackson and Taranok faced criticism, accusations of idealism and naivety, but they pushed through, their resolve unyielding. "Remember why we're doing this," Taranok reminded Jackson one evening after a particularly tough day. "We're not just fighting against apathy, we're fighting for the future." "Right," Jackson replied, determination flickering in his chest. "We can't lose sight of that. Every small victory counts, even if it feels like an uphill battle." As the movement grew, so did the challenges. Jackson and Taranok received threats from corporations resistant to change, their interests jeopardized by the push for sustainability. One evening, as they prepared for a public demonstration, Jackson felt an unsettling tension in the air. "Do you think they'll try something?" Taranok asked, glancing out the window. Jackson hesitated. "I hope not, but we need to be cautious. They won't go down without a fight." As the demonstration began, the atmosphere was electric with energy. People gathered, united in purpose, chanting for change. Jackson stood at the forefront, feeling the power of the crowd behind him. But then, chaos erupted. A group of protesters, fueled by corporate interests, crashed the event. They shouted slogans, trying to drown out Jackson's voice. Tensions escalated as they clashed with supporters, and Jackson's heart raced as he saw the chaos unfold. "Taranok, we need to restore order," he shouted over the noise. Taranok nodded, determination in his eyes. "We can't let them derail this." Together, they stepped forward, raising their voices above the clamor. "We are here for the earth. We are here for a better future." Slowly, their words began to break through the noise. People turned to them, and the chaos subsided as Jackson and Taranok reminded them of their purpose. "Remember why we're here," Jackson called out, his voice strong and unwavering. "This is about more than just us. It's about every living being on this planet." Gradually, the crowd rallied behind them, the energy shifting from chaos to unity. The dissenters were pushed back, and together they forged a collective resolve. As the demonstration concluded, Jackson felt the weight of the moment. "That was close," he said, breathless. Taranok nodded, eyes scanning the crowd. "But we held our ground. We need to be prepared for more challenges like this." "Yeah," Jackson replied, feeling the gravity of their situation. "This fight is far from over." Weeks turned into months, and the movement began to shift public opinion. The Green Council took notice, supporting their initiatives more robustly, and the tide seemed to be turning. But in the shadows, resistance brewed. One evening, as Jackson reviewed plans for an upcoming summit, a message pinged on his device. It was a news alert. Corporate interests had launched a smear campaign against their movement, spreading misinformation and fear. "Look at this," Jackson said, showing Taranok the screen. "They're framing us as extremists, trying to discredit everything we've built." Taranok's expression darkened. This could undermine our efforts. We need to counter this narrative. They strategized, drafting responses and gathering testimonials from supporters. But as they prepared for their next public address, the stakes escalated. In the midst of their planning, a key supporter was attacked. News spread quickly. An individual who had spoken out for change was violently assaulted. Fear rippled through their ranks, and Jackson felt a knot in his stomach. "We can't let this deter us," he said, voice firm. "We have to stand together now more than ever." But uncertainty hung in the air, doubt creeping into their thoughts. Taranok placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "We'll find a way through this. We always do." The next summit approached, and they gathered their supporters for one final push. As the event unfolded, Jackson felt the weight of the moment. This was their chance to turn the tide. Standing before the crowd, he spoke with fervor. "We have faced challenges that have tested our resolve, but we will not back down. We are the voice of change." Cheers erupted, voices rising in unity. But the atmosphere remained tense. Everyone was aware of the dangers lurking just beyond their movement. Days after the summit, tensions escalated further. Jackson received word of a planned attack against their headquarters. Panic coursed through their ranks as they mobilized to fortify their defenses. In a dimly lit room, Jackson gathered his core team. "We can't let them silence us. We need to stay one step ahead." Taranok surveyed the group, his expression serious. "We must take precautions, but we also need to keep pushing our message. We can't allow fear to dictate our actions." As the hours ticked by, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He understood the risks involved, but he refused to back down. When the attack finally came, it hit with brutal force. Their headquarters was swarmed, and chaos erupted as they fought to defend their space. Jackson and Taranok stood side by side, directing efforts to protect their supporters. "Keep pushing back," Jackson shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins. "We can't let them break us." The clash intensified, shouts echoing around them as they stood their ground. Taranok fought fiercely, the energy from the columns coursing through him, fueling his strength. Jackson felt a surge of determination as he rallied their supporters, urging them to stand firm. But just as they thought they might prevail, darkness enveloped the room. Smoke filled the air, choking their senses, and Jackson realized they were being overwhelmed. "Retreat," he called, fear gripping his heart. "We need to regroup." In the chaos, Jackson lost sight of Taranok, his panic rising as he fought through the crowd. He pushed forward, desperate to reach his friend, to ensure they both made it out alive. Finally, he spotted Taranok near the exit, struggling against the tide of bodies. Jackson rushed to his side, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the fray. "Come on," he shouted, urgency flooding his voice. "We have to get out." Together, they fought their way through the chaos, adrenaline surging as they pushed towards safety. Once outside, they stumbled into the fresh air, gasping for breath. The chaos continued behind them, but they had escaped the worst of it. "We need to regroup," Taranok panted, urgency lacing his words. "We can't let this setback define us." Jackson nodded, determination igniting in his chest. "We'll find a way to turn this around. We can't let them win." They quickly rallied their core team, gathering in a safe location to assess the situation. Fear hung in the air, but Jackson stood tall, willing to shoulder the weight of their hopes. "Listen, I know things seem bleak right now," he began, looking each person in the eye. "But we can't let this defeat us. This is just one battle in a much larger war." Taranok added, "We've come too far to turn back now. We will rebuild, and we will rise stronger than before." With renewed resolve, they outlined their next steps. They needed to address the misinformation campaign head-on, countering the narrative with the truth of their mission. In the following days, they worked tirelessly, launching a counter-campaign filled with testimonials, video footage from their events, and clear messaging that highlighted their commitment to sustainability and unity. They organized a press conference, inviting media representatives to hear their side of the story. Jackson stood before the cameras, determined to present their message clearly. "We will not be silenced by fear," he declared. "We are here for the future of our planet, and we will continue to fight for what is right." The response was overwhelming. Support poured in from unexpected places. Individuals who had been hesitant began to speak out in favor of their movement. The tide began to shift, and Jackson felt a spark of hope ignite within him. As the days passed, the momentum continued to build. Their supporters rallied around them, fueled by the renewed message of unity. Jackson and Taranok worked tirelessly to regain lost ground. They organized another summit, this time inviting prominent figures from the corporate sector to address the need for sustainable practices. Jackson crafted a powerful speech, determined to bridge the gap between industries and their cause. On the day of the summit, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Jackson stood at the podium, heart racing as he faced the crowd. "We stand at a crossroads," he began, voice steady. "Our planet is in peril, and it is our collective responsibility to forge a new path. Change is not just an option, it is a necessity." He outlined the benefits of sustainable practices, showcasing success stories from businesses that had embraced eco-friendly initiatives. As he spoke, Jackson could see the spark of interest igniting in the audience. Taranok stepped forward, sharing his insights on the importance of collaboration between sectors. "Together, we can create solutions that benefit not just our companies, but the very planet we depend on." The dialogue flowed, and Jackson felt the shift in the air. Questions emerged, ideas sparked, and discussions blossomed. For the first time in a while, he felt the winds of change stirring. After the summit, Jackson and Taranok engaged in one-on-one conversations with key leaders, emphasizing the need for partnership. They forged connections that would prove invaluable as the movement continued to gain traction. Months later, the movement had transformed. They secured partnerships with businesses, educational institutions, and community organizations. Jackson and Taranok had become respected figures in the fight for sustainability, their message resonating far beyond their original circle. As they prepared for another public event, Jackson stood on a balcony overlooking the bustling city, feeling the weight of their journey. "It's incredible how far we've come," Taranok said, joining him. "But we must remain vigilant." "Agreed," Jackson replied, determination firm in his voice. "We can't let complacency set in. This fight is ongoing." As they descended to join the crowd gathering below, Jackson felt a surge of excitement. People had come together, united by a common purpose, a desire to create a better future. The event unfolded with energy, attendees sharing stories, engaging in discussions, and committing to sustainable practices. Jackson stood at the forefront, watching as hope blossomed in the eyes of those around him. This was what they had fought for, a community coming together to protect the planet. As the day progressed, Jackson felt the weight of their journey transform into something powerful. Months turned into years, and the movement continued to evolve. Jackson and Taranok had become influential voices, advocating for change on a global scale. Their message resonated in boardrooms, schools, and communities. One day, as they prepared for a significant conference, Jackson reflected on how far they had come. The battles they fought had forged a legacy, one rooted in unity and resilience. As they stood before the audience, Jackson smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment wash over him. "Together, we have shown what is possible when we unite for a common purpose. Our planet is worth fighting for, and together, we will create a future filled with hope." With that, he felt the energy in the room shift, the power of collective determination igniting a fire that would continue to burn brightly for generations to come. Jackson knew this was just the beginning. The fight for the Earth was far from over, but they had forged a path toward restoration, a journey that would carry on long after they were gone. And as they stepped into the next chapter of their lives, they would carry with them the lessons learned, the connections forged, and the unwavering belief that together, they could change the world.